Welcome to the CDA Institute's Geopolitical Update. I'm Josh Malm, Director of Research and Analysis for the Institute, and I'm joined by geopolitical expert Joseph Varner, Deputy Director of the Conference of Defense Associations and former Director of Policy for the Minister of National Defense. In this podcast, Joe will provide his analysis and insights on the most significant geopolitical and international security developments of the week. So grab your headphones and get ready for a concise but comprehensive update on the world's most pressing geopolitical issues. The CDA Institute encourages rigorous debate on national security matters through our events, research, and publications. Joe, great to be with you again for the Geopolitical Update. Can you provide our listeners with a brief overview of what's been happening on the global stage this week? What are the key highlights and trends that we should be aware of before we get into more specifics?
The big events this week are related to Iran, North Korea, China, and Russia, and in particular related to Iran's nuclear program, North Korea's satellite program, which has implications for its ballistic missile program, and Russia and China's recent summit, where they made a number of policy points on nuclear weapons.
Thanks, Joe. Why don't we start with Iran's nuclear weapons program?
Last week, we talked about the death of Iranian President Raisi, and I mentioned Iran's nuclear program. And it's since been revealed that Iran has increased its stockpile of enriched uranium to near weapons grade levels. Iran has now amassed some 142.1 kilograms of enriched uranium, up to 60%. This is a 16.95% increase in Iran's stockpile of 60% enriched uranium since February. Iran has been using the conflict with Israel and Hamas in Gaza to also speed and increase its nuclear program. And as we all know, weapons-grade uranium is uranium that's enriched to 90% purity. We saw in April and May several senior Iranian officials make comments to normalize the concept of Iran having nuclear weapons. And Tehran now has enough highly enriched uranium that should they wish to, they could produce in theory, about 3 nuclear devices. But if they increased their enrichment process, they could produce somewhere between 7 and 8 nuclear bombs, theoretically. And that has a number of implications for security in the region and could open Iran up to preemption and or attack by Israel.
Thanks, Joe. North Korea is in the news again this week, this time because of a failed spy satellite launch. Perhaps you can provide an overview of what's been happening in Pyongyang.
North Korea suffered another satellite launch failure on Monday, the third failure of a reconnaissance satellite launch in just a year. The Hermit Kingdom appears to be developing a higher thrust engine that is powerful enough to carry multiple satellites on a single rocket. Pyongyang blamed this failed launch on moving to a new advanced rocket propellant technology based on petroleum and liquid oxygen that caused the first stage of the rocket to explode. Prior to the failed launch, a number of Russian technicians and scientists entered North Korea, and there were a series of engine tests. At first, it was believed that this was because the Russians wanted to ensure the North Koreans had success in launching their satellite. But it now appears that the Russians may have transferred space launch vehicle technology to North Korea in the form of the Angara space launch vehicle. This is the same launch vehicle that they also provided and sold to South Korea, which is kind of funny when you think about it. But in the case of this launch, this would be a direct example of a technology transfer from Russia to North Korea as part of their growing strategic partnership. And this has implications as well for North Korea's military intercontinental ballistic missile program. If you can put a satellite into space or several satellites into space from one rocket, then you can likely put several warheads into space from one missile. And that's very important to the North Korean strategic deterrent.
Thanks for that insight, Joe. Now onto our final topic. President Xi Jinping and Russian President Vladimir Putin signed and issued the joint statement on deepening the China-Russia Comprehensive Strategic Partnership of Coordination for the New Era. Quite a mouthful there. What is the significance of this meeting, and what is notable about the communique?
The recent joint communique of the May 16th summit went largely unreported, but gave a new insight into Russian and Chinese nuclear thinking. First, the summit communique appears to indicate that President Xi sees nuclear weapons as having a utility in a way different than his predecessors. And second, it drops the previous opposition to nuclear weapon states deploying weapons abroad and their previous demand that deployed weapons should be withdrawn. And third, the communique warned against the U.S. deployment of land-based intermediate-range missile systems in the Asia-Pacific region. And fourth, they also warned the U.S. and NATO against providing extended deterrence to individual allies, and they criticized the AUKUS cooperation on nuclear submarines and the building of infrastructure in Australia. If you look at today's press, you'll see that the United States is considering the deployment of nuclear-tipped land attack cruise missiles on submarines. This is a change from policy that actually removed these weapons from U.S. ships back in 1992. And you'll see that Russia has announced that they're going to consider deploying intermediate and short-range nuclear missiles to both Europe and Asia. And China has condemned the United States deployment during exercise of an intermediate-range weapon system to the Philippines. So more to follow on this.
As we near the end of today's episode, Joe, do you have any parting insights or reflections you'd like to leave our listeners with?
Well, the top item that Canadians might want to keep an eye on is Canada in the run-up to the NATO summit in early July in Washington, D.C. In the last week, you've seen the U.S. ambassador to NATO and the U.S. ambassador to Canada, and indeed 23 senators send a note to the Prime Minister criticizing Canada's lack of defense spending and urging Canada to increase its defense spending to make the 2% GDP goal that Canada and all other NATO countries have agreed to. And this is likely to come up at the summit, and I think you can expect to see great pressure put on Canada to come forward with defense spending measures and a plan at the summit to meet that NATO goal. Another item that is definitely worth watching is NATO's continuing debate over whether or not Ukraine should be allowed to use weapons that NATO countries have provided that have a long-range strike capability to strike targets within Russia proper. This has been a big debate. It's been a contentious debate, and the Russians have made a number of threats. A senior Russian think tanker, Dmitry Suslov, suggested Moscow consider a demonstrative nuclear explosion. For clarity, essentially a nuclear warning shot to warn NATO against allowing Ukraine to use Western-provided long-range strike weapons against targets deep inside Russia.
Joe, thank you for your insightful analysis and for guiding us through this week's geopolitical developments. To our listeners, thank you for tuning in. Be sure to join us next week as we reconvene with Joe to delve into another week of global affairs. Additionally, you can tune into the CDA Institute's expert series. This week, we invited Philippe Lagacé, Stephen Seidemann, and Chris Sands on to discuss Canadian defense spending, the defense policy update, and the upcoming NATO summit in Washington. Until next time.